Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ISO IEC 17025 2017 UCAS Transition Process webinar. I'm Jeff Ruddle, I'm UCAS's Strategic Development Director. I'm joined by my colleague Paul Greenwood, our Operations Director. And this afternoon, we're going to take you through a short presentation just outlining UCAS's transition process. That'll take about 20, maybe 25 minutes maximum. And after that, we will take Q&A from the attendees. So I think we've got an hour programmed in for the session, so we've got plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. But what we'll do is run through this presentation quickly beforehand, which hopefully will answer a number of questions that people have. So in terms of the agenda for the webinar, we're going to have a bit of a look through the metrics, what sort of some of the timeframes and deadlines are for this transition, what UCAS's process is, and we're going to take a bit of time to have a look through the transition template and provide some guidance on that. This is a document that all laboratories who are transitioning their UCAS accreditation for 17025 will need to complete and return to us. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at what information you need to provide to us in there. And we'll also touch upon what training and support there is available for you if you feel you need it to help you meet the new revised standard. And as I've already mentioned, we'll be taking questions at the end. So hopefully by the time we get to the end of the session, we'll have given customers some clarity on the transition process, those timeframes and deadlines, what actions that they need to take, and what they can do, what you can do yourselves to aid your transition, make it as easy as possible on yourselves. It's worth saying that this webinar is being recorded. We're doing a series of 6 of these webinars. This is the 5th one, and one of those versions will be published on the UCAS website probably within the next few days, along with a series of FAQs that we've had coming through from the sessions that we've run. So if you do need to go back to it, or if you've got colleagues that weren't able to attend, there will be a copy for them to watch up on the UCAS website shortly. So it's worth just mentioning a couple of things about questions before we go on. Firstly, you don't need to wait to the end to send your questions in. You feel free to send them in as we go through the process of the webinar. Actually be quite good if we've got one or two before we get to the end, just so we've got something to start on. But we will be taking all those questions at the end of the webinar. Whilst when you send it in, we will know who you are from the name that you send in. We won't be reading out who has asked the question. We'll just be answering them generically. We won't be saying who they've specifically come from. However, what we won't be able to do is we won't be able to address sort of laboratory specific questions. If there's something very specific to your laboratory, primarily because myself and Paul perhaps don't understand the full context of your organisation, we won't be able to answer those kind of ones. But what we will do, if in your question you can tell us what organisation you're from, we'll make sure that that question gets back to your assessment team, that they contact you to talk through the question or query that you've got. The same as well on interpretation of specific 17025 clauses. Whilst we can give a bit of generic advice and interpretation, and we'll aim to do so if any specific clause questions come in, again, we won't be able to answer anything that is specific to your organisation because we don't understand the full context in which the question is being asked. So again, we will, in those situations, look to take the question from you and get it to your assessment team so they can get back to you and discuss the specific situation relating to your laboratory. So moving on from questions, talking a little bit about the metrics of the transition. So we've got here at UCAS roughly just under 1,600 laboratories that we need to take through that transition. And overall within there's about 3,000 independent review points that will take place during that transition process that we carry out. We've also had to train about 300 assessors and decision makers within UCAS to enable us to have the resources ready to carry out that transition. And we've got 36 months in which to complete all of that. To put in a bit of context, UCAS has done a number of these transitions for standards over the last few years, but this is the largest transition UCAS has ever conducted. And given that the UCAS is one of the largest accreditation bodies worldwide for laboratory accreditation, it's also one of the largest transitions of accredited bodies that will be taken place in recent years. Timeframes wise, the ultimate deadline for this is the 30th of November 2020. After that date, the 2005 version of 17025 will cease to be valid. Now, this isn't a date that UCAS can change, can move around, can work around. It is a deadline that cannot be moved. So if a body has not transitioned by that date, we will not be able to continue accrediting them. So if someone fails to get through the transition by that time, then their accreditation will be suspended for a period of up to 6 months, after which time it will be withdrawn if they haven't completed the necessary actions to transition themselves by that time. We have planned our transition and the timeframes involved in it, so we should make sure that we avoid that situation. And our plan is to make sure that all of our customers get through well ahead of that deadline, so we don't have any problems with customers not making it through and having to have their accreditation no longer valid. Breaking down the timeframes a little bit, just to look at back to a little bit about what's happened, but also what's happening at the moment and into the next few months. The standard was published 30th of November 2017, and UCAS was actually quite heavily involved in the drafting of that standard. One of my colleagues, Trevor Thompson, was on the drafting committee for it, so we were well aware ahead of the formal publication of the standard what sort of changes were coming through, and we've been preparing ourselves, preparing our training for our staff and assessors for the new standard that was coming along. So shortly after its publication, we were able to complete and conduct the training of our staff and assessors, and also send out information to our customers on the timeframes and prepare the communications that were needed for the transition in here. So by 1st of March 2018, we were in a position where we could conduct assessments, but we advised all of our laboratories that we would be transitioning them in 2019. Very few really wanted to go early and chose to have their assessment earlier. By choosing to have their assessment earlier, they have got additional costs. Now, there's for every organisation going through the transition, there is a cost over and above their normal annual assessment charge. But those that chose to go early, not have it combined with their annual visit, have had costs even over and above those. We stopped accepting new applicants to the old version of the standard, the 2005 version, from July 2018. And then at the start of this year, start of 2019, we started a period of 12 months where we will be conducting all of our assessments against the 2017 version of the standard. So it's mandatory that the annual assessment in 2019 takes place against the 2017 version of the standard. And that is to ensure that we get all of our customers through well ahead of that deadline in 2020. So we've had quite a sort of common FAQ as we put the communications out to customers back end of 2017, early 2018, is why the assessment will be mandatory during 2019. Well, there's a number of factors in here. I think firstly, reflect back to the scale of the work that UCAS needs to perform. We've got quite a large number of bodies to take through this, and what we've seen in previous transitions that we've done is that where we provide a large degree of choice, of freedom about when the transition assessment happens, the majority of organisations leave conducting their transition to the last 6 months of that 3-year transition period. And obviously, that's manageable when you've got a small number of organisations going through transition. But when you've got 1,600 organisations going through transition, if that happened, we would be at significant risk of quite a number of our customers not meeting that deadline. So we want to avoid that, which is why we've gone for the making sure we space out those assessments over a 12-month period, and we can make best use of our resources and really minimise that chance of anyone not making it through the transition. It also gives us a contingency. There are bound to be some unforeseen circumstances as we come towards the end of 2019, unavailability of resources from UCAS side, or maybe some problems within the laboratory, a fire or flood or something that means they can't have their assessment at the back end of 2019. Doing this in the way we've done it means that there'll be plenty of time in early 2020 to conduct that assessment and ensure that there is adequate time for that organisation to transition ahead of the November deadline. So UCAS's transition process. A few things to point out on here. You don't need to request the transition from us. UCAS will be starting your transition. It's be taking place in 2019, as I've already mentioned. You don't need to send us an application form. Your transition will be assessed alongside your scheduled annual visit. There is some additional chargeable time that we will be putting to this to conduct the review and conduct the transition. The amount that is being charged will depend upon the size or complexity of the laboratory. As a rough guide, this isn't a definitive guide, it's a rough guide. For small laboratories, so perhaps those of a small number of staff, maybe only 2 or 3 technical activities on their schedule of accreditation, they're likely to see a charge of around about half a day. For the majority of our organisations, what we suppose term sort of a medium-sized laboratory, so obviously a reasonable number of staff, reasonable number of technical activities on its scope of accreditation, they're likely to see a charge of around 1 day. For our largest laboratories, those with multiple sites, overseas activities, several different technical disciplines on their scope of accreditation, they're likely to see costs in excess of a day for their transition on there. As part of the process, one of the things we'll be doing is conducting a desktop review of the transition template that you as a laboratory will be sending through to us. Now, that isn't the only thing we're doing for the transition. In fact, that transition template is mainly there to prepare our assessment team for the on-site assessment, which is where the majority of the assessing will happen for the transition. So the transition template should allow our assessment team to be able to identify the focus areas for the on-site assessment. So areas where you as a laboratory have made major changes, or the change that you've implemented doesn't appear to be compliant with the new requirements of the standard. Obviously, that'll come out through the more in-depth assessment on site. So we'll be looking through that transition template and reviewing it in advance of turning up to help us focus the on-site assessment that we're carrying out. That transition template as well, whilst it's something you send in at the start, it will form the basis for the report that we conduct for the assessment. So it's quite a slight different approach to our normal assessment reports, and it sort of works through on a clause by clause basis. And it will be, so go through it on a clause by clause basis, and you'll get information and feedback based upon the specific clauses that you do and whether those are complying with the standard or not. We will be raising, where needed, improvement actions specific to the transition, and those obviously will need to be closed out prior to any grant of transition. Following on from that assessment, an independent decision will be conducted to review and approve the assessment team's recommendation. That will obviously give us a level of calibration, of consistency, make sure we're all approaching it in the same way. So that is one of these independent checkpoints that I mentioned earlier on. When you do get through the transition, when your transition gets approved, you will get a new accreditation certificate and a new schedule referencing the new version of the standard, but your accreditation number and your initial date of gaining accreditation will remain unchanged. So moving on to have a little bit of a look at the transition template. In a minute, I'll ditch out of the presentation and go to look specifically at the template and also where you can get it on the UCAS website. This template should be coming out to you several months in advance of your assessment. It should be sent out to you from your customer liaison officer at the point that we start to begin looking at arranging your assessment. So you should get it a few months in advance. But you don't have to wait for us to send it to you. It's available from the UCAS website, and I will shortly show you where you can get that if you want to download a version and start filling it in now. When you do send it back, please send it back to us at least 1 month prior to the assessment, ideally earlier, but at least 1 month in advance. And that is to make sure that the assessment team have got time to review that in advance of your assessment. Now, the content of what you submit will be discussed at your assessment. It's unlikely to be discussed in advance. It might be, I suppose, if there's something that's a bit unclear that just needs a bit of clarification, your assessment team might contact you, but we aren't planning to talk it through with you in advance of the assessment. It will be done at the assessment. The information you put into that transition template must describe the changes that the laboratory has made for the new standard. So It can't just be a cross-reference to some procedures or a quality manual. You need to tell us what you've done in a sentence or two. It doesn't need to be a huge, long description, but a rough outline of what you as a laboratory have done to address the changes, and then a reference to where we can find the more detail in your quality procedures, your SOPs, etc. Within the template itself, UCAS has identified what it considers to be new requirements, what it considers to be major and minor changes. So that, for you as a laboratory, should help you identify where we're going to be looking to focus. Obviously, the new requirements and the major changes are going to be areas of more focus. They're expecting to see the laboratory having made a change in the activity that's performed. Okay, if you want to bear with me a second, I'm quickly going to pause the presentation and go and get the transition template. Okay, so this is the transition template. First thing to mention is it's a Word document. If you could please return it to us in that format, because as I mentioned earlier, our assessment team are going to be adding to this document as they go through the assessment process, and it will eventually become your report. So please don't send it back to us in a protected format like a PDF, because the team will need to amend and add to it as they go through the process. Now, the first part of this template is an overview of what you need to do. That's what I've talked through here, so I'm not going to read through it now. That tells you the same information I've just been talking through at the moment. Following on from that is a couple of examples of what kind of level of information we're expected to see coming back. So here is an example of what we'd kind of be looking for a major change. This isn't actually a change in the standard. These are example changes, so don't feel this is something you need to do. This is just an example provided. But this would sort of be the level of information we'd be looking for here for a major change. And in the case of a minor change, this kind of level of information here. So if a minor change, still saying that you've kind of looked at it, maybe identified there's no need for a change, and then saying which part of your documented procedures you feel demonstrates you meet that requirement. If you are going to refer to a large sort of quality manual or a large procedure, it's very useful if you can provide us with a reference to the page or the section numbers that are relevant to that area, just to help us with that. Going a bit further into the document, you can see there's a key to the extent of change. There's a lot of structural changes to the standard. For those of you who are also accredited to other 17,000 series standards, you'll see it's come into the same structure as the others. But for those of you who just have your accreditation 17025, you'll probably see that the requirement, that a lot of changes, things have moved around in the standard and it's become under quite a different structure. Then there's minor changes where we feel overall the wording of the requirement has changed, but it's consistent with previous requirements. Major changes where we feel you may need to implement new or change existing practice, and new requirements where it's something that wasn't in the previous version of the standard. Now, what some people who've found who have already got accreditation to other 17,000 series standards, they found that some of these new and major changes they've already met through transitioning to other standards. That's normal. That's because we're now bringing 17025 up to the same structure and requirements as those other 17,000 series standards. The rest of the document then is the main area that you'll be filling out as a laboratory. There is a cross-reference between the old standard and the new standard in here. So if you want to sort of sit down with the two of them side by side and see what has actually changed in those two requirements, you should be able to find it within there. It's not always a strict one-to-one relationship. Some things have been split out into multiple requirements. Some things have been condensed into single requirements. So it isn't just a sort of one-to-one mapping across. So that could be useful for you to look through to see how you might need to make changes within your system within there. So that is the template. As I've mentioned, it is on our website. So if you want to download a copy of it, if you go into the customer area on our website, on the left-hand side on the bottom here is an area for 17025 transition. If you come into that link, you'll come to these set of pages here. And about halfway down the page, in the area highlighted as the UCAS transition process, there is the ability to download a copy of the form in that area of the website. So you can go and get a copy of that now. It's worth saying, if you've already been really proactive and started a while ago with an older version of the template, I think we're on version 2 now, there is no need for you to go and get version 2 and transfer all your information across. The only updates we've made between the versions is to include more guidance and more help for organisations submitting them. The actual content of what you need to provide back has remained unchanged, so you can keep the work you've already done on previous versions of the template. Okay, a few important points to make regarding the transition template. As I've mentioned, please provide details of the changes you've made. Don't simply reference updated procedures or quality manual sections. In a sentence or two, tell us what you've also done about it, what changes have been made. Get the template back to us at least 1 month, but ideally further in advance of the assessment, and please keep it in its Microsoft Word format. Don't return it to us in a protected format. It's also worth saying at this point that there are a lot of changes to the standard, fundamental change to the structure of the standard. But in many cases, a lot of the changes aren't considered to be significant, and therefore you shouldn't be looking at doing a major overhaul of your system. If you find yourself doing a complete rewrite of your quality management system as a result of this standard being updated, you're probably overdoing it, and I would recommend going back and looking at what the changes actually are and seeing and updating those bits that need to be changed. A couple of points to mention as well on the transition template. If we get a submission in that doesn't satisfactorily address the previous points that we've mentioned there, that could potentially increase the cost of the assessment, because it may result in additional time being taken by our assessment teams to perform the review that they need to do if the information isn't clear, isn't well presented, if there's difficulty getting access to it. It's also worth saying that the assessment that UCAS is doing is not a gap analysis for the laboratory. If we turn up for the assessment and find that no attempt has been made to prepare for the transition, then we will be cancelling that assessment, and there will be an extra assessment conducted at a later date once the laboratory has prepared. Obviously, that cancellation and the additional assessment costs will be chargeable to the customer. So that's obviously a situation we'd really like to avoid by making sure our customers are prepared for the assessment when we turn up. Support and training wise, if you do feel you need a bit of support and guidance regarding the new versions of the standard, if you're a member of the British Measurement and Testing Association, they have information. They've been doing a number of seminars around the new version of the standard, so I'd recommend getting in touch with them. Also, we're on the ISO website in the area for 17025. There's a short video. There's a downloadable document as well that explains the changes in the standard and why they've been brought about. There's obviously the information that's on that 17025 transition area of our website, and within there, that link to the transition template. If you do feel you need something a little bit more sort of formal training-wise, UCAS does provide some training courses. We have a number of short one-day seminars aimed at organisations that are very familiar with the 2005 version of the standard, just want to understand the changes in the 2017 version. So there's a number of those courses happening over the next few months. The details are available in the training area of our website if you want to look on there. For anyone who's sort of coming at it from scratch and wants to know everything from the sort of bottom up about the new version of the standard, we are running some longer 2- and 3-day courses on the 17025 2017 standard, and details of the dates of those on our website as well.